John Miles here. I'll be presenting some in-depth information on how to photograph the iris. My background is I was at the University of Michigan and first got interested in the eye during work at the ophthalmology research lab at University of Michigan. And then about 1990 I came to the West Coast to study the iris. And during this time, the last 26 years here, I've been primarily developing iris camera technology as well as doing research into the iris itself. This presentation will have 5 sections. I'll present some information on the camera lens, the importance of illumination, exposure, how to get good focus, and client interaction to get the best possible image of the iris. So this is all about the iris, and this is the end goal. We need to get a high quality, sharp, clear, well illuminated, well focused picture of the iris. Iris photography is important because it's a primary source for information on the iris. And first here I will present various types of cameras that can be used, and then go into the importance of controlling various factors affecting the iris photograph. Generally there's several types of cameras. The non-professional cameras would include the compact or pocket camera, cell phone cameras. I've been working with mirrorless cameras with the macro lens, but primarily recommend the DSLR camera with a macro lens. Compact cameras are not to be considered a professional solution, but they are okay for beginners and students that just want to have a few $100s invested, and some compact cameras I find work better than others. Generally, a focusing light is required in addition to the camera. I've found that the Sony CyberShot seems to work the best, and I'll show some examples. All of these compact camera iris photos will be based on these 3 Sony CyberShot models. Currently they're discontinued, but there are more recent versions. When you're using a compact camera, it has a built-in lens, and you can only get so close, so you can't really have the iris fill the frame, but you can get close enough so that you could crop that picture down to a reasonably usable picture that doesn't have very much resolution, about 1 megapixel. And this again is primarily for beginners and students. Here's another picture, and as you can see I take the whole eye area and then crop it down to just the iris. For most all compact cameras there's several settings that are necessary regardless of the brand and model, and they're generally you'll want to have the camera set up for program mode. That's my preference. The tulip icon signifies a macro mode, and the flash must always be used. You won't get a very good iris photo unless you force the flash to be on. Here's a similar model, the W200. And as I mentioned, there's 4 steps. You use program mode, you set it to macro mode, which is always signified by a tulip icon, and you set the flash so that it will always be on. And the 4th setting is to make sure that you're not on a telephoto mode. You want it to be all the way on the non-zoomed mode, the W for wide angle. Here's another example. It's often good to have the client tug their eyelid down a bit to show the whole iris. Cell phone cameras can also be used, but it's somewhat challenging to get the iris in focus, and it often requires supplemental focusing light. And just like with the compact camera, some cropping will be required to get just the iris photo. But these don't generally work as well as a compact camera, and I have tried many different types of macro lenses and several different types of cell phones, but I have made Chinrest for the cell phone camera. That often helps, but I don't generally recommend this. The technology is not quite there yet. The DSLR camera is the right way to go. You must use a good macro lens, and my preference is the Nikon 85mm macro. I do use Nikon almost exclusively, although I can make illuminators and cameras based on Canon or Sony other models as well. Before the 85 macro came out, the Nikon 105 was the one to use, but it weighs twice as much, costs twice as much, and is quite large, so I no longer recommend that. If you have a Canon camera, there's only one good choice, which is the 100mm. In all cases, you will need a focusing light, and it's always best to use an illuminator of some sort to get proper illumination of the iris. Iris photos require a flash, a xenon flash. LED lighting doesn't generally give very good detail because it's just not enough light, and it also has not quite balanced for daylight, and so I don't generally use LED lights for photography. They are okay and quite suitable for focusing lights. For the iris photo, you have a choice between central lighting or side lighting, and that just refers to how many degrees away from the lens axis that xenon flash illumination is. Central lighting would be anything under 15 degrees from the axis. The ones that I make are generally 11 degrees from the axis, and that's very good for image measurement because the illumination is very uniform, and the corneal reflex, the flash reflection, will generally appear to be in the pupil area, and the side lighting would be anything from 15 degrees to 60 degrees from the axis. And if you go farther, I call that extreme side lighting. That would be up from 60 to 90 degrees from the lens axis. The side lighting is best to illustrate the texture, and this is very helpful for the brown iris, where texture is more important because the heavily pigmented anterior border layer has the information on the iris. I've also made 3-channel illuminators where you can choose between right, center, or left illumination. But you do need to control the angle of illumination for consistent results. The angle of illumination will also help to control reflections and glare. Now, the most basic setup, which I've come out with this direct flash illumination, is the least expensive. It's basically the camera and lens. They're readily available off the shelf for about $500 each, and then you need a focusing light, and this is the attachment you see in this figure, and as you can see, you can get fairly good photo. This is a photo taken of my own iris using autofocus. I just held the camera up to my eye, put it on autofocus, pushed the button, and got a pretty good picture. The central lighting will give a much better illumination and more uniform lighting because the built-in flash is going to be giving you about 30-degree angle of lighting, but the central lighting will be about 11 degrees from the axis. And these come in 2 varieties. One is a single central lighting, and the other is a 4-point central lighting. As you can see, you get a very well illuminated uniform iris photo, and it's ideal if you're going to measure the iris. The side lighting comes in 2 varieties. The fixed side lighting, where the lights on the left, you can see that camera has the lights always at 45-degree angle, which is a standard reference position for the side lighting. That model, you have a choice between left, right, or both. It also has a built-in focusing light, and it can attach to, I can make them attach to any macro lens. The adjustable side lighting gives you a lot more control over the angle of illumination, and in some cases that is helpful for imaging the inner zone of the pupil, for example. Here's a brown iris, and by using the side lighting, the texture is illustrated very nicely due to the shadow casting indicating the terrain features. Also, the brown iris often has textured, sometimes you'll see boscillations or small little bumps on the anterior surface of the iris, and to show these you really do need to have side lighting. The only downside of side lighting is there will be a brightness gradient. For example, this test target, which has a series of concentric circles ranging in diameter from 1 to 10 millimeters, is a bit brighter on the right side as you look at it. The test of the lighting uniformity is done with a gray card, and the gray card is a standard reference target which has a single solid gray color. And as you can see in the upper picture, it's a brighter gray on the right and a darker gray on the left, whereas with central lighting it's pretty much a uniform gray all the way across the range. And that's illustrated by the histogram, which counts up how many pixels are found at each brightness level. And so in the bottom example, you can see it's a much more concentrated distribution around the single true gray color. And the side lighting shows you a range of grays that are more spread out. The brightness gradient can be emphasized by doing a histogram equalization. And in this case, you can see that the enhanced photo of the side lighting illustrates that brightness grading. The top lighting, which is direct flash illumination, also has a bit of a gradient, but the central lighting doesn't really have much gradient. This is what it looks like when you do histogram equalization. You spread out the range of pixel values. So for example, on the bottom one, you'll see it's almost a perfect Gaussian curve after it is spread out, but it's still pretty much a one main brightness level. In the side lighting example, they're ranging from bright to dark, so that the distribution of brightness values is much more spread out. The effect on the iris photo is mostly noticeable in the brown iris, but even with the blue or mixed iris, you'll find that the central lighting has a bit more glare around due to the nose, the bridge of the nose found in the medial sectors, and yet the advantage is that you can see more of the iris without the reflection. However, the reflection is not generally problematic, and most people can learn to work around that, and it doesn't generally cover up any important features. The third type of camera here, Illuminator, has 3 channels where you can choose between center, right, and left. And these side and center models also come in either the adjustable side lighting, as you see on the right, or the fixed side lighting, where the 2 side lights are fixed at 45 degrees. Plus there's a third channel which you can select for central lighting. Here's another comparison, and in the bottom pair with the side lighting, the iris will tend to be a bit darker at the medial sectors. I've also made a range of an adjustable arc illuminator, as I call it, and this is shown with an alignment target that includes a protractor, so you can pretty much dial in whatever angle you want, and the light will always be at the same distance from the iris for uniform imaging. The alignment target has a protractor, and it generally these days attaches with a magnet, so it's easy to detach it. And it includes a target for aiming the lights, as well as a color correction tab, which is right below it. You'll see the black, gray, and white tab, which I'll talk about a bit further later. The fixed side lighting, as you see on the left, will have the lights at exactly 45 degrees, and the adjustable can be set to any degree, generally from about 20 degrees over to 90 degrees. Here is the adjustable side lighting set to the minimum of 15 degrees, almost like central lighting. Then there's extreme side lighting, where the lights are 80 to 90 degrees from the lens axis, and this even more illustrates the texture and terrain variations. Generally more noticeable on the brown iris since it has the opaque anterior surface. Here's another example. There's such an extreme angle that there's quite a bit of shadow casting, but it does show the contraction furrows. The method pioneered by Dr. Daniel LoRito for the imaging of the inner pupillary border is to use the lateral light at 80 degrees and the center light at about 20 degrees. So that would be set up for the right iris, and this will give you the best image of the inner pupil border. Here's an example with that type of lighting. It will reveal the pupillary rough, quite good detail, as well as the texture surrounding the pupil of the iris. This is the other eye taken with the opposite light arrangement. Alignment spacers have been added recently to the adjustable side lighting so that you can quickly set the lighting angles to the reference 45 degree setting. They are taking the place of a spacer washer, and they have cutouts to hold the two lights at exactly the right angle, so you don't even need the protractor to set these angles, and they will hold the lights at that reference position. When you want a different angle, you just adjust this by loosening the tightening knob and rotating that alignment spacer back out of the way. Then you can set the light to whatever angle you want. Reflections and glare is an important concern in iris photography, and in this example there are two primary reflexes where the light comes from the camera, bounces off the cornea, and comes right back to the image. Those two reflections are from the illuminator and the focusing light. But there are often seen, especially with the brown iris, secondary reflections where the light is bouncing off of the skin around the eye, or the fingers which may be holding the lids open. You can see the index finger at the top and the thumb at the bottom. The eyelid, eyelashes are seen here, and the canthus, and often the bridge of the nose will show up. To minimize these type of secondary reflections, you want to retract the lid as much as possible, and it's generally more of a problem with the brown iris since it has a darker backdrop for the reflections to appear, and for that reason the brown iris is often better imaged with a side light. The central lighting will produce even more glare, but this is an intentionally selected bad example. Now the focusing light brightness will also affect the pupil size, and that affects the appearance of the iris. As you can see in this example, these pictures were taken of a client consecutively, and with the focusing light off, the pupil is larger and the iris appears to be a bit darker shade of blue, and the fibers are more separated. Those are actually radial vasculature, and you can see through to the dilator muscle more, so that it shows up as a darker color. So be aware that the brightness of the focusing light will affect the appearance of the iris. The ideal brightness would give you a 3 millimeter diameter pupil, and that is a good reference. So dial the focusing light back down so it's right about at the 3 millimeter point. Exposure. The most important consideration is you always use a xenon flash. You always use an electronic flash for iris photography. And there's two basic methods for controlling the exposure. One is to use the flash in manual mode, where the brightness is fixed, set at a constant value. I usually set up the camera to use 1/2 power because you don't really need the full amount of power, but it will always be the same brightness. Then the exposure in terms of the brightness of the resulting image is controlled by adjusting the aperture. More recently I've been using the TTL Flash mode, that's through the lens, where the camera will estimate how much flash illumination is required and will automatically cut off the light when the right amount of light has been observed. With this mode you can choose any aperture you want, but as you'll see that there are some apertures that are better than others, and I recommend f/22. The reason this is important is if you take a picture of any iris, these were all taken consecutively at different apertures from f11 through f25, and you don't really know which is the true color, the true shade of brown that the iris is, unless you do color calibration, which will be shown presently. Additionally, you always need to set your DSLR up for flash white balance. This is based on the power spectrum of the light, and flash is very similar to overcast sunlight, but it is designed to work exactly with the built-in flash or an external flash. So for best results you always set the white balance control to flash. And when you first get a camera, it'll generally be set up for auto white balance, but you want to change it so from the word auto to the lightning bolt icon is showing that to signify it is set for flash white balance. And if that isn't the case in your camera, you change this by going to the shooting menu, and as you can see you move into that menu and move it from auto down to flash, as you can see on the left. And then you hit the OK button, and when you look at the shooting menu you'll see the lightning bolt icon to signify that you're now in a flash white balance setting. Color correction tabs are usually found, for example, on Amazon, and they have a white, gray, and black portion, and you just include that in with your camera photo. You can take it by itself ahead of time, and you can use software to correct any possible color distortions. They come in a pack of 20, and they are adhesive, and you'll see them also on the alignment target. So for example, this, for checking your white balance, you take a photograph of the alignment target, and on the bottom you'll see the black, gray, and white. And those are used to set your computer so that it will automatically correct the subtle shades of color to be ideal. This is using the Corel Paint Shop Pro. This is version 18, and it has what's called a smart photo fix, where you just click on the black, the gray, or any white area. You can see the little markers on the left, and it will redistribute the color points of the white, gray, and black to be more uniformly distributed over the center of this range of brightness, as you can see in the lower right histogram. The red peaks show the corrected position, and the gray peaks. As you can see, the white hasn't changed very much, but the gray and the black have shifted to the left a bit just to be a little more accurate. The exposure mode for iris photography using a DSLR always has to be the aperture priority mode. That is signified by the A in the MASP sequence. This is generally a top-mounted mode dial, and other cameras such as a Canon may have it on the left side, but you must set it to the A mode for best results. Here's an example with the Nikon D3200, and when you go back to general photography with your camera, say putting in a zoom lens for other types of pictures, all you have to do is rotate that dial back to auto, and it will override all the other settings that are made specifically for iris photography. Then when you go back to the macro lens and the illuminator for iris photography, you be sure to set it back to the A mode. The manual flash mode and the TTL flash mode are set up from the camera here. You use the menu button first to bring up the menu, and then the menu nav are 4 arrows surrounding an OK or confirm button. This camera has been set up for manual flash mode, as you can see by the M next to the lightning bolt icon on the last item in the list. When in this mode, you control the exposure by setting the aperture, and you'll do that by rolling the thumb wheel to the left or the right. To the right makes a higher number, which is a smaller aperture, and to the left reduces the aperture number. I usually, with manual mode, take 3 or 4 pictures of each iris, and each picture shot with a different consecutive aperture. Here you can see how the aperture number is opposite to the actual diameter of the opening. So this is actually the iris of the camera we're seeing here. And the larger the number, like f16, corresponds to a smaller opening, which is partly why it is has a slash before it. It's like 1/16 the amount of light, and f8 would be twice as much light as f16, and f4 would be twice as much light as f8, and so on. You can check the aperture by looking at the back of the camera, and in most display modes there's even a graphic indicating the relative size of the aperture. Here, as you can see, f7.1 on the left, f11 in the middle, f25. You want to be somewhere between 16 and 25 generally. And this is taken with the manual flash, and as you can see, the smaller aperture, f11 in the upper left, lets in more light and makes a brighter picture. Then when you're selecting the best picture of each iris, you need to make sure they both have the same brightness. For auto exposure, which I'm currently recommending, you use the TTL through the lens flash mode. And in this case, the aperture setting will not affect the exposure, but it does still affect the depth of field. With the aperture number, there's a trade-off, so it is nice to have a larger depth of focus, depth of field, but as you go above f16 or so, there becomes a trade-off because there's something known as diffraction blurring with the large aperture numbers. The pictures will be somewhat less sharp when you go above f25, and actually the macro lens is optimized for f5.6, but that has such a narrow depth of field that it's not practical for iris photography. So I recommend using somewhere between f16 to f25. To set for through the lens flash mode, you again use the menu button to bring up the menus, and you'll use the navigation button arrows and the OK to confirm your settings. You want to go to the shooting menu, which is the second icon, the green camera icon, and then you use the right arrow to get into this shooting menu, and you go down to the flash control for built-in flash, and you want to change it from M to TTL to make it in the TTL mode. And when you're done, as you can see on the lower right, it will say TTL with a flash lightning bolt icon. This is what the shooting menu looks like after making that setting. Additionally, you want to set the exposure compensation. Now, this is necessary to brighten the iris. So what exposure compensation does is it increases the amount of estimated brightness by, I use +1, which is exposure value EV +1. Without it, then there will be shadows somewhat darker, and it's nice to bring out the darker areas, so you set the exposure compensation to 1.0. Here's an example, again taken with autofocus of my own eye. And first on the left is how the TTL auto exposure works without any exposure bias or exposure compensation. As you can see, I bring up this detailed settings of the picture just by right-clicking the image file name, going to Properties, and then clicking on the Details pane. And on the right is the same picture taken after setting the exposure compensation to +1 step, or +1 EV exposure value. And as you can see, you get a much nicer detailed picture of the iris. To change the exposure compensation, with most cameras there's a plus and minus button. In the left figure, the number 1 shows pushing down on the plus minus button, and number 2, you roll the thumb wheel to the left or the right to change it. And on the right picture, you can see how the plus minus setting has gone from 0.0 to 1.0. That's the correct setting. So there's 2 settings you need to make for auto exposure. One is TTL flash mode, and the second one is exposure compensation. Now you can explore other values like +0.7 or +1.3 and see what works best for your setup. Generally 1.0 is about the right amount to boost the brightness just a bit so the iris is easier to see. These are the color correction tabs I've mentioned, and they will help you check your exposure, and once you find the necessary fine-tuning of the white balance and the color, you can save that setting in your image editing program and apply it automatically to all your pictures. Focus is very important, so the objective here is to get the entire iris in sharp focus. Several factors affecting the focus include whether using manual or autofocus. And now I always recommend manual focus, which is fixed at the minimum closest focus range. The autofocus is good for testing things out, and it works pretty well in most cases with the blue iris, but it often doesn't find a good focus with the brown iris because of a lack of contrast. The aperture setting will also affect your focus. That'll affect your depth of field, or the range of distance that will appear to be in focus. The client's angle of gaze will also affect it. You always want the client to be looking straight into the center of the lens so that their visual axis is in alignment with the camera's lens axis. Variation in the iris surface terrain will also affect the focus, and that's why you need to have enough depth of field to cover that variation. Which point you choose to get in focus is important as well. And when you're using a DSLR, through the viewfinder you'll be looking at the wide open aperture with the minimum depth of field, and this will emphasize any out of focus areas. You also have to set the viewfinder focus to match your vision. I'll explore these 6 topics now. As mentioned, I always recommend using fixed focus. That's manual, where the lens slider switch is on M, and then after that you set the lens to the closest focus and you don't change it. So for this, lens also comes in two settings. First, set to manual. Second, set it to the closest focus. If you want to explore the autofocus, you just set the lens over to M/A, and this is the marking on Nikon lenses which they chose, because even though it is autofocus, you can override it by rotating the lens barrel, so it's kind of manual and automatic, but it will be automatic. The other switch on many lenses for vibration reduction, that's what Nikon calls it. There's other ones like optical stability and other designations. You always want to turn those off. The vibration reduction is not relevant to flash photography. It's only for when you're not using a flash. And since you always use a flash with iris photography, you never want to use VR for iris pictures. It simply drains the battery and it doesn't accomplish anything. The iris terrain can vary up to 1/2 millimeter, and this is a cross-section of the iris specimen, and as you can see there's quite a bit of variation. So you need a sufficient depth of field to accommodate that. Also, it turns out that the iris is tilted laterally pretty nearly in everybody, about 5 degrees. It's called the kappa angle. So when the person is staring straight ahead into the center of the lens, their iris will actually be tilted outwards towards the lateral direction. And as you can see in this annotated, this is a laser generated using optical coherence tomography, a cross-section of the cornea and the iris. You can see that the tilt is about 5 degrees, and that means to get the whole iris in focus you need to have at least 0.7 millimeters in depth of field. You'll need more than that because there will be optical effects. So since the iris is slightly tilted laterally, and here's a photo of a right iris, the best place to shoot for your focus is at the 6 o'clock sector, because that will not be tilted forward in the vertical center line. It will be tilted in the horizontal midline, so that the temporal or lateral sectors will be a little bit further from the camera, and likewise the medial sectors will be slightly closer to the camera. So don't use those points for focusing. Focus at 6 o'clock or 12 o'clock. The refractive effect of the cornea is also going to cause some variation in the focal plane, and it's good to know that when you're looking through the typical cornea, you'll be looking in the center at a magnified view of the iris features. Can be up to 28% magnified compared to the actual dimensions, and this is simulated by a plano convex lens on a Ranchi ruling, where each line is 1 millimeter in thickness, and the lens has a curvature of 7.5 millimeter radius of curvature, which is about what the cornea is, and the refractive index is slightly different, but it illustrates the point that you're actually looking through a magnifying lens when you see the iris. For measuring the depth of field, we use a depth of field block, and I set up the camera vertically so that I'm looking at it at a 45-degree angle. And the depth of field block has lines which are spaced out so that when you look at it at 45, they appear to be 1 millimeter apart. So they actually multiply that interval by square root of 2, and that way we can take pictures of this block at different apertures. And here's some actual photos. So at f5, which is wide open, hardly more than 0.5 millimeter is in focus. The longer lines are 1 millimeter apart in this case. At f11 we have about 1.0 millimeters depth of field. At f22 we get about 1.5 millimeters, and at f45 up to 3 millimeters is in focus. So I've made these measurements, and I recommend using f22 because you need about 1.5 millimeters depth of field. That will allow for the refractive effects of the cornea, the surface terrain, the iris tilt, and possible errors in focusing. If you go above that, you'll lose a bit of sharpness, as I mentioned, due to diffraction blurring. The exception is for the scleral photography, you want to have the maximum depth of field. So you would use 45. The viewfinder focus is a small control placed right near the viewfinder on most DSLRs. On some cameras it's a slider switch with 5 positions. In other cameras it has a little rotary dial. You'll see the plus and minus there. And the way this works is you have to match it to your vision, so it's even possible for you to see a well-focused image in focus. And to do that, you look through the eyepiece viewfinder at a distant object like a white wall, something that's blurry, and you run through the range of settings of this viewfinder setting until you get the focusing points at maximum sharpness. You want them to be sharp, thin black lines that you see in the viewfinder. If they are not sharp, then you need to change that setting until they are sharp. And each person has different visual characteristic of their own eye, so if someone else is going to use the camera, they need to change this setting to match their vision. As long as you're the only operator of the camera, and this generally is mostly only a concern with macro photography. When you're taking pictures of people or outdoor scenes, it's not really critical. But for detailed, precise macro photography, you must check your viewfinder focus. And your result will look like this. And you can tell this image is properly focused when you see the little stippled pattern right in the pupil. That's the texture of the lens. And you want that to be in focus. You want the pupillary rough, the border of the pupil, to be in focus. And when that's in focus, pretty much everything else will be as well. As I mentioned, if you're doing photographs of the scleral vasculature, just dial up the aperture number to the maximum. Additionally, it's important that the center of the pupil is at the center of your field of view. Several reasons for this, but one is that the lighting will be properly placed. With center lighting, there will be the reflections will center around the apex of the cornea, which is always slightly to the toward the nose and slightly above the midline. With side lighting, the amount of light will definitely be affected if it's off-centered, so you always want to have the pupil centered in the field of view. That's easy to see because in the viewfinder you'll see the little focusing marks and you can line it up. It's very important. For handheld photography, the photographer puts both elbows on the table generally, and the client also can support their head and stabilize it by putting both elbows on the table. As you can see in this illustration where the left eye is being photographed, the client is opening their lids with their left hand and covering the opposite eye so that they don't inadvertently look through that eye. The client is asked to look straight into the center of the lens, and when they do that, they'll see a tiny little reflection in the center of the lens, and you ask them to observe that small reflection. Sometimes they'll see their whole iris. Other times they'll just see a white dot of light. That is what you want them to be looking at. And again, it's very helpful to cover the opposite eye. Most clients would prefer to separate their lids themselves rather than you reaching in there. Plus, it's somewhat preferable not to make contact with the client. So self-lid retraction is best, and it generally works on most people, but not all people. So when you need to assist the client in retracting their lids, I recommend the cotton-tipped applicators. And these are easily found online. You can get a box of 1,000 for about $10. And they're kind of like long Q-tips with 6-inch wooden sticks. And what I do is, again, having the client covering the eye not being photographed with the hand on that side. And they generally can do their own retraction of the lower lid, as this person is. But oftentimes, to avoid their thumb or other finger getting in the way, it's somewhat better for the photographer to retract the upper lid with the cotton-tipped applicator. You want to be very gentle, never apply pressure toward the globe of the eye, but instead you place it gently on the eyelid and you roll it upward into the eyelid so that it moves it as far away from the iris as possible. This will avoid those secondary reflections, which are sometimes a concern. If you have a chin rest, you can also use 2 cotton-tipped applicators, and so that's possible, and I've learned this can be done with either hand, and the other hand can be used to actually take the picture and position the camera. So step 1 is to gently rest the 2 cotton-tipped applicators on the upper and lower lid, where the 2 ends of the applicator are joined, meeting up in the palm of your hand, and you put your thumb right between the 2. Then you push your thumb through the 2 cotton-tipped applicators, which causes the 2 wooden sticks to counter-roll in opposite directions, and this rolls the eyelid away from the iris, and that way you will have them sufficiently far from the iris to avoid reflections. Now, chin rests can definitely expedite the photography of the iris, and I make many different models, but these are the 2 preferred models. The professional model has a wide range of chin height adjustment, and it has a very smooth focusing track, and it can easily be disassembled into a compact carry bag. And the economy model is a newer version, costs about half as much, and that also can be dismantled without any tools for portability, and it's almost as good. A little bit less stable perhaps, but it's very convenient for traveling. You can also get a Chinrest-Only, which can be a tabletop clamping model, and that's convenient if you have a desktop and you just want to get the Chinrest-Only and still use handheld photography. It greatly assists in the stabilizing of the client's head. And I have other portable models. It can be on a tabletop tripod with an adjustable height chin cup, and these also break down to a compact shape, and these are just some of the possible models. You can also get a support just for the camera. So on the left you see there's a focusing track and a positioner, and that can be used along with a tabletop clamping chin rest. And on the right side you can see this is what I use sometimes to take my own picture. I just put my head there and look into the lens, take the photo. That looks like a Canon lens there, Canon camera, and that works quite well too. It's always a good idea to have a box of tissues or possibly even some alcohol prep pads, and I recommend you wipe down the chin rest and the forehead rest before each client photo session. You can do it afterwards, or you can do it both times, but you should do it right before the client sits down, because then they see that you're taking care to make sure that they have a very clean, sanitized surface to put their head in. Plus it may have accumulated dust, or you may not know how clean it was to begin with, so I always do it right before the photo session. I found that a Kleenex is sufficient for wiping any oils or moisture off the forehead rest, And even if you have the type of chin rest with chin rest papers, you'll want to wipe down that chin cup area as well as removing the chin rest paper. Also, I recommend you, if you have enough space in your office, to use an adjustable height overbed table, and this will be a good surface to hold the chin rest, and you can easily adjust the height. There's a spring-loaded counterbalance in that vertical tube, and then that way you can get it to match the client's seated height as well as your own height. I also recommend you use adjustable height chairs both for the client and the photographer. And you can either get a stool, or on the left is an ordinary task chair that you can get these for $30 or $40. It's an excellent investment. And before you start your photography session, you want to adjust that chair to the upper height, or if you can gauge the height of the client, you could adjust it to match them, but I generally start off with it all the way up, and then once they're seated, just gently tap that until they reach a comfortable height for the chin rest or the tabletop. And I always have my own chair already set to the right height. And this ends part 1. Thanks for watching this video, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me at my email or the website, and I'll be making further instructional videos on iris photography in the near future.